Hello, you're listening to the New Music Podcast. My name is Jennifer Torrence. I'm a curator at New Music, and today I will be speaking with the composer, intermedia artist, and performer Marko Ciciliani. Marko will be coming to Oslo in June to present his new work, Why Frets? And in this episode, we will be talking about his ideas of transmedial composition, storytelling across media, his notion of music in the expanded field, and composition as designing modes of encounter between an audience and the work. All the music you will hear today is from Why Frets. Welcome, Marko Ciciliani.
Hi, Jen.
My name is Marko Ciciliani. I'm a composer and intermedia artist. I started out as an instrumental composer, but already since more than 2 decades, I've been gradually shifting to multi and intermedia formats. And at first, I started to work with lighting, then I expanded to live video. And in the past years, while at the beginning I was mainly focusing on very sort of specific relationships between visuals and music, I have started in the past years to expand to even other domains like writing texts, editing books, and I have become very interested in this sort of transmedialization also of certain ideas that are in the center of a project. Yes, the project that I'm going to present, at least partly in Oslo, is one such project, Why Frets? And consists of 3 main parts, 2 of which are going to be shown in Oslo, an installation, and the other one is a performance lecture.
You brought up a lot of different things there that I want to come back to as we move along in the episode. But one thing I wanted to understand better already now is transmedia. This is a word that pops up a lot in different contexts, and I wonder what you mean by it in general and also specifically in your work.
Yeah, that's a very good
point, because this term is really used in many different ways, which can be quite misleading. I use it in the sense of transmedia storytelling. That means my understanding of transmedia is a content that flows across different media formats. That implies that we are talking about more than one piece, but a series of pieces which are dealing with the same topic and looking at it from different angles. That said, I personally don't want to understand this sort of transmedia only in the strict sense of storytelling. So in the project Why Frets, I guess we'll talk more about it later, you will see that there is indeed an underlying story. However, I want to think about transmedia as something that can also, which doesn't sort of force us to tell literal stories with plots, etc. But it's a particular way how to organize musical material and musical ideas across different media and across time. Because when we're talking about more than one piece, it also means we can't hear or consume them all at the same time. So it's also a sort of prolonged process of taking them in, developing an idea, what is this about, putting together the different perspectives. So it's also a very particular, you could say, process of interpretation that is involved through that. And this is something I find very exciting.
I also find it really exciting, and I struggle to think of any other artist who works in this way. You're somebody who, when you make a new work, it could appear in almost any format. I mean, anything from a concert with live performance, there will often be some kind of audio-visual component, but that could be an installation, or it could be performance with live technology, or it could be an interactive work with audience and a kind of performance installation, or a hybrid work, as you say. But you also work in text and image formats with websites. So I guess what I'm trying to understand here, when you're working in a transmedia way, what is it that these formats bring? Why do you do it? I understand that you already mentioned that you want to give different interpretations to a kind of material. But if we look at Why Frets specifically, this is a piece that has an installation, an audiovisual performance, and a lecture performance. What do these different formats bring in terms of angles onto the material?
First, I want to say I'm not the only one working in this way, and actually, it's you could find many transmedia works if you look also in the visual arts, but also in music. Like just an example. Peter Ablinger has been working on this series of works, which is called Weißlich. And he's created, I don't know how many, I think around 40 of them, maybe even more. And they are all dealing also with one central topic, which is whiteness, the idea of and the idea of noise. And okay, so if we would take 5 musical pieces that deal with this, in a way, I would say it's not transmedia because they're sort of staying in the same media format. But he also made like visual works that are part of this. He made performances that are part of this, very conceptual works that are part of this that he then also realized as a sort of interview with audience members. And that's totally transmedia. He doesn't use the word, and that's interesting. And I know quite a few other examples of such works that, in my understanding, qualify as transmedia. But interestingly, almost nobody uses the word transmedia. And I think that's also showing that it has not been fully recognized as one particular way to think about artworks. And yeah, so that's even more a sort of encouragement for me to dig into it. But to get back to your other question, why am I doing that? I mean, I've been working a lot with intermedia works and multimedia works, where I'm just combining different media at the same time. I said earlier, for a while, I was really focused at very specific relationships between, let's say, video and music. And then gradually, I started also to work with hybrid formats, formats which are in between concert situation and installation situations. And at a certain point, it just struck me, okay, so you can have like a room and then you have different elements that are all making a particular installation. Not always, but very often an installation can consist of very heterogeneous materials and entirely different entities. And so one day it struck me, what if we replaced the physical space with time? So basically, we're just taking the different components and we look at them individually. And we're replacing the architectural space also with a sort of mental space, because if we then hear and see these works one after another, they come together in our memory. And again, this brings in this whole question of interpretation. How do we make sense of that, and so on. I've also done some earlier works where that I would describe as transmedia. But there it was more about translating a particular concept to different media. So I have a piece which has a sort of sounding version, but then I have the same concept translated into text. So I generated texts on the basis of the same process, and I generated a series of images based on the same process. And then again, we have like this sort of the same idea, which is sort of traveling across the different media, but because they are moving to a different medium, they're taking on very different characteristics. And this is also one important point for me, that the things don't repeat. It's not about making like a second version of the same thing, but every part of a transmedia project should really add something new to it. And in the case of Why Frets, it's more a sort of, you could say, a sort of expansive arrangement, that there is like a core story, but then every part of the piece is expanding on the story or highlighting a different aspect of it.
Right, and this idea of storytelling leads us in a very nice way to Why Frets, which is the project that you'll be showing in Oslo on June 1st. Well, you'll be showing 2 of the 3 pieces that make up the total Transmedial project, Why Frets. But storytelling is a concept or an activity that runs through so much of your work, and in particular, a kind of look at history and old texts and old cultural ideas and interrogating them and being critical and often reimagining or reinventing aspects of the story so that something new or some kind of new perspective might emerge. And in Why Frets, you're telling the story which is about the death of the electric guitar. I want to hear more about this and what the story is, and also what motivates you to tell it.
Yeah, so
just to explain, so Why Frets is based on a fictitious history of the electric guitar, which is told from the year 2083, a time where the electric guitar is not being played anymore. And the whole starting point is that there is a historian who's trying to reconstruct how the guitar came into being, how it became such a popular instrument, and how it suddenly fell into oblivion. And so there are different theories that are discussed, and all of this is part of the performance lecture. To get back to your question, why I'm interested in historic topics, I find it very interesting to look at historic topics and try to understand how much of that still influences us today. Because it's easy to think of history as something separate from us that happened a long time ago, and this has absolutely nothing to do with our reality anymore today. And this is, of course, not the case. And I'm very interested in trying to understand how these things are still affecting us today. And so in the case of Why Frets, it's a fictitious history, but so I'm telling a history which is wrong. So just simply, it didn't happen that way, unfortunately. But I think it's still a very interesting thought experiment to think, to try to imagine how we would look at the electric guitar if it was true what I was telling in the story. And it's just opens the possibility to develop a differentiated understanding of this instrument, also with its whole cultural implications. And this is actually the reason why I decided to focus on the electric guitar. I think the electric guitar is a very versatile instrument, and as an instrument I totally love it, but then there is really this sort of also problematic chauvinistic connotation of this instrument, how it's been used in lots of rock and roll music, and this makes this instrument very complex, and that's what I love about it, and therefore it's a great instrument to try to kind of take apart this whole historic context.
Yes, this historical play that you do is so important to understand your work. And you're also somebody who's very generous with supplying the references and all the background information to your pieces. So I recommend to any listener who wants to learn more and read more to go to Marko's website, and you'll find tons of stuff there. But while I have you, I wanted to ask about the term speculative fabulation, which, like transmedia, is a term that pops up in a lot of different places and projects. And this is a term that you use to describe your work with storytelling in Y frets and also in other works. And this is a concept that was proposed by the American philosopher Donna Haraway. First of all, what is speculative fabulation? What is it for you, and how do you employ it in these pieces?
Basically, it's what I already said. It's try to reimagine or think differently about our present time by looking at history in a different way. And what, of course, also has to be acknowledged is that we can read about history in many different ways, but every history, and we tend to take it as a fact. But every history is, of course, also an interpretation of past events, and every history leaves out so many things, and therefore history is not this unambiguous one static thing that we left behind, but it's something that we sort of have to also reinterpret constantly, and interpreting the past is also a way to start looking at the present time in a different way. Right. And that again opens different possibilities for futures.
Right. I think that's a really critical point about this notion of speculative fabulation, that it's not just dreaming up a new world that doesn't exist that maybe we could create, but it's actually looking at the past with a critical eye, as if to say, what if we turned this knob a little bit? What would happen? What new trajectories could open up? And yes, this is what you're doing with this, in particular the lecture performance in Y frets, where you're turning a dial, which has to do with questions around gender and opening up a whole new path for the guitar and also music history. Okay, I wanted to shift gears now to talk about your scholarly work. Because in addition to being an incredibly interesting and innovative artist, you're also one of the few people who is able to articulate trends that are happening in the field on a general level. And perhaps the most read and cited text of yours is your 2017 article called Music in the Expanded Field: on Recent Approaches to Interdisciplinary Composition. This is a text where you build on Rosalind E. Krauss's 1978 article called Sculpture in the Expanded Field. And you draw a parallel where she's saying that sculpture is no longer a medium in itself. It's rather an umbrella that can carry many different kinds of media, whether that's photography, books, or mirrors. All of this could be considered sculpture. And this also resonated very much for me in my own practice as a performer, where I was trying to understand what it means to be a performer in this contemporary music landscape where the instrument is constantly in transformation. And this article and also the Krauss helped me understand that the instrument isn't an object, but it's an action, and it's an object that's in relation to the performer. So this is a text that I think is a wonderful read for anybody who is interested in these kinds of topics. But in particular, if you're interested in looking at how media has become, in a way, the instrumentarium for many composers today, where in the past, perhaps the piano or the violin or certain groups of instruments would be what the composer was concerned with learning how to compose for. Marko is proposing that actually it's laptop and lights and other kinds of software and homemade DIY motors and so on and so forth. So what I want to ask you, Marko, is now we're 7 or 8 years after this text, and I wondered if you have any new diagnoses for the field, if it's continued to expand or how you see it. And in particular, there's one part of the article where you talk about teaching and learning. And you talk about how at that time, and perhaps still, so many composers are basically autodidacts because there are so few courses or institutions who are teaching how to use these new media. So I wonder what you think about all of this.
Well, if you're asking me about the teaching aspect, I would say it hasn't changed in the way that if you work in this way, you have to sort of accept that you're a lifelong amateur. And that's, of course, something that's also a problem in this way of working. That, I mean, it's obvious if I make an audiovisual work and I program my graphics myself and so on, it's not going to look as fancy and as good as if I would be collaborating with a video artist who has been doing only this for 30 years. And however, the way why I so fascinated by this approach to composition is that if you do everything yourself, which is not a necessity, but that's how I usually approach it, it's a very inspiring process to just bounce back and forth between the different media. And you, through this process of going back and forth, you discover ways how to create connections between the different media, which I would never arrive at if I wouldn't get, my hands dirty and do it myself. But so I think in terms of education, what has changed is that constantly it's getting easier to teach yourself stuff. Like there are so many really good tutorials on YouTube to learn almost anything. So if you compare this to the situation 30 years ago, it's a completely different one because it's the information is readily available. So you just have to take the effort and try to learn it, and the instructions are out there. But it doesn't, of course, solve the problem with the lifelong amateur, because watching YouTube tutorials is going to help you to get started and to get probably quite far, but it's not going to replace the 30 years of experience that you're lacking. So in that sense, I would say that things have changed, but also, yes, just some very basic things have not. In general, I would say that what I describe as this practice of music in the expanded field is quite common nowadays. It's not really rare.
Now I'd like to turn to more recent research which builds on the expanded field ideas, and that's your research on works that you call hybrids. And this is a term that we've been referencing obliquely throughout the episode, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time on it. And you propose that hybrid works are works that exist between a concert and an installation. And in your research on this, you spell out the characteristics of a concert work in terms of how time and space is distributed and used, and also dramaturgy and focus and audience agency in terms of being able to come and go, and then also looking at the installation and its use of time and space and audience agency and dramaturgy and narrative. And then you are looking for works which take aspects on either side of this coin, so to say. I find this also very exciting and also very elusive. It's hard to think of works that really manage this balance. So I wanted to ask you what it is that you're looking for when you're researching hybrid works.
I'm looking for a very particular way how I can offer the audience an encounter with my artwork. And by leaving the standard concert situation, possibilities are just becoming much bigger. So I'm talking about these sort of modes of encounter. And that's also something what I find very relevant in the hybrid works, but also in the transmedia works, that each little component is not only using different media and maybe different aesthetics, but there are also addressing the audience in a different way and offering the audience to explore or experience this particular piece in a particular way. So this is something what I find very interesting about when I'm searching for hybrid situations, which are not standard concert situations, or maybe also not standard installation situations, if anything like that exists.
I find that audience interaction or audience participation is underdeveloped in the field of contemporary music, if I can be so generalizing as that. I wonder, do you have any strategies for how to build such a work?
Yeah, like one strategy is really the question of proximity. How close do you get? Are there things that you can touch? I mean, a standard concert situation usually implies that there is a certain distance between you as an audience member and the place where the music is performed. It's almost like the music is performed on a tray and you're looking at it from a distance. It almost has something also positivistic in the scientific way, that you kind of have a safe objective distance, and now you're kind of critically examining, is this really good or not? And but then you can, of course, also be in an environment that is engulfing you. Immersive situations, as it's usually called, but that already means that you're completely embedded in something, which is already changing the distance. And then, of course, there can be elements that you can usually literally touch. This is relatively rare, but usually when you have some way to interact with things, then you're also touching things. And I think all these small details are just changing your relationship between you as an audience member to the work. And it's like a different sort of communication which is established. So this is the idea of proximity, but then I already mentioned also interactivity. And interactivity, maybe we shouldn't get into this now. I have a sort of love-hate relationship with it, but I think that interactivity also immediately changes the relationship of an audience member to the work. And in my opinion, it's not even that important how much impact the interactivity has. I think it's not so decisive whether audience members can completely turn a piece upside down or whether they're only affecting minor details. But as soon as they can affect something, they are becoming part of it. And I think this is the crucial thing, this sort of sensation that they are now becoming part of something. Yeah, so these are aspects, but then I mean, also all the little details that affect the atmosphere of a performance, the lighting. Usually you can't really affect the smell, but in some cases I also tried to create certain odors in a installation situation or a hybrid situation. So I think all these small details should not be underestimated.
This is not.
I think maybe just to add one thing, I think the crucial thing is that the designing this, what I call mode of encounter, designing the mode of encounter is as much part of the composition as everything else. I think that's in a way the key in the understanding.
Thanks again to Marko Ciciliani. If you're interested in hearing and experiencing Y Frets, come to Oslo on June 1st. There you'll also get to experience brand new works by Marcella Lucatelli,